Paul George apparently wanted to stay in Indiana before he forced his way out through a trade, and he apparently got one of the star power forwards in the NBA to agree to team up with him in Indiana with the Pacers. In this video, we are going to try to figure out which power forward he is talking about, and if Paul George or the Indiana Pacers is in the wrong for how the events of this transpired. Let's get into it. What is up, everybody? Jacob Miller here, back at it again with another video talking about this Paul George situation. He's talked on a podcast about how he only forced his way out of Indiana because they refused to team him up with another star, even though said star was interested in joining him with the Pacers. This is Amateur Hour Sports, where we give you raw and unfiltered sporting content Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. So if it is your first time here with me today, make sure you are subscribed for insight and opinion on the sporting world, as well as some informative videos on the history of sport. Paul George is certainly one of the best players in the NBA, and he also was at the time in 2017 when these events transpired that eventually led to him forcing his way out through a trade to the Oklahoma City Thunder, where the Pacers acquired Domantas Sabonis and Victor Oladipo. He's also arguably a top 3 two-way player in the NBA right now, and was always a phenomenal defender in his time with Indiana, getting them to, some decent playoff runs, but never anything spectacular when it came to that. He was never at the level where he could carry a team on his own, though you very rarely see a player capable of doing that in the NBA other than really LeBron James and maybe a Kawhi Leonard in this day and age. So being very hard for a single player, even an MVP level player, to get their team to an NBA championship or that NBA championship caliber level is very hard to do on your own. And apparently in the offseason of 2017, Paul George had the best power forward in the NBA, according to him, who wanted to team up with him and play with him. And if that was Indiana, so be it. You very seldom see any player wanting to go play in Indiana. It is by no means a destination city in the NBA. But Paul George spoke on the Knucklheads podcast, where he was quoted to have said, "I had at the time the best power forward saying he wanted to come to Indy and team up with me. But they were like, we're a mid-major, we're a small market. We can't do it. We're a small market, we can't afford that." As a result of Indiana saying this, Paul George grew irate and added on in the podcast by saying this: "What am I doing here? You know what I mean? They don't want to win. I've got the best power forward that wants to come play here. Not everybody chooses Indy to come play here. This dude wanted to come play here. They didn't want to do it." So first of all, we got to figure out who the hell Paul George is talking about here. The best power forward in the NBA in 2017? Well, that was Anthony Davis. He had just come off being a first-team All-NBA, though that was as a 5, as a center on that All-NBA team, but we know that Anthony Davis is better at power forward. So it is possible that Paul George was talking about AD in this circumstance, but it is unlikely because Anthony Davis was still with the Pelicans at the time, and Paul George makes it seem like this was a player who the Pacers could acquire at the time. And Anthony Davis, who had 3 years left on his contract in New Orleans and, was a bit untouchable for them. And also the Pelicans had just acquired DeMarcus Cousins, who was arguably the best center in the league. I know it's 3 years ago. Boogie was one of the best centers in the league. It's incredible how far he's fallen from injuries since then, but they just acquired DeMarcus Cousins to play with Anthony Davis. The Pelicans probably thought they could contend for a decent playoff position. There is no way that it was feasible for Indiana to acquire Anthony Davis, not to mention that Paul George was really the only sort of asset they had to trade, so they didn't have the firepower and quality players to trade for AD. In free agency, however, in offseason 2017, there were 2 power forwards who were looking at exploring new teams. Those 2 players were Paul Millsap and Blake Griffin. And for Paul Millsap, no disrespect to Paul Millsap, but we're talking about arguably the best power forward in the NBA, according to Paul George. That is not Paul Millsap. Paul Millsap is a great player, but he is not at the caliber of the level that we are trying to talk about in this scenario. And besides, Paul Millsap ended up signing a 3-year, $90 million contract with the Denver Nuggets. So the Pacers could have afforded that if they wanted to. It is very, very unlikely that Paul George is talking about Paul Millsap in this situation. Blake Griffin is definitely the most likely suitor to this mystery man we're talking about. He did end up re-signing with the Los Angeles Clippers on a 5-year max contract, but it is reported that he did speak with other teams before signing with the Clippers. So very possible Blake Griffin could have had some words with the Indiana Pacers. Now, it must be said that Indiana really could not have afforded to sign Blake Griffin on a max contract, especially for 5 years, especially given that Blake Griffin was coming off an injury and is notorious for being very injury prone. So a risk like that maybe wasn't feasible for the Indiana Pacers. So it's possible that Paul George had a bit of omission of facts in this scenario. Maybe Blake Griffin did want to play in Indiana with Paul George, assuming that it is Blake Griffin. And given what I've just conjured up in terms of the facts about that summer offseason, it does seem like Blake Griffin was the man, but Indiana maybe could not have afforded that max contract, but according to Paul George, Blake Griffin wanted to be there. And even if Paul George is omitting some facts, it is no secret that Indiana is very well known for being a cheap and thrifty organization, and they have done well at getting by, but they didn't do enough to assemble a championship caliber roster for Paul George. Because again, this is a cheap organization. They have not paid any luxury tax since the 2005-2006 NBA season, and in the last 5 years, the highest they have been on the NBA's payroll is 22nd. So always bottom 8 in terms of the salaries that they're paying their players. So they never really could assemble a phenomenal team on the court with that amount of money being spent. So maybe Paul George was fed up with Indiana's inability to create a championship level roster around him, giving him the pieces to succeed, because Paul George isn't at the level to dominate and win games in the playoffs on his own and win those, late playoff games on his own. He did need another star to play with, and if Indiana couldn't acquire that, maybe that's why Paul George left. And if I was Paul George, I'd probably do the same thing. You got to know that entering your prime, you want to be able to challenge for these championships. And if this team isn't going to equip you with the tools to do that, then unfortunately, you do have to move on. But there were rumors that Paul George wanted to get a trade to go home to LA, and maybe he's using the Indiana front office as his scapegoat for wanting that trade. Maybe he's using this to blame them to take away the blame from himself. So do we blame Indiana or do we blame Paul George in this situation? Bottom line is, Paul George wanted to stay in Indiana, and Indiana couldn't give him the roster that he needed to succeed because he isn't that MVP level player. I know he was a finalist for MVP a couple of years ago, but I don't have him on the level of the LeBrons, the Currys, the Hardens, the Kawhis, the Giannis's, those types of players. He can't just win the games on his own. And even those guys, some of them, can't win an NBA championship on their own. So I don't think Paul George could have done it. And the Pacers, who weren't giving him the tools he needed to succeed, well, Paul George wanted to go somewhere where he did have those tools, and, fair on him. He wanted to go win an NBA championship. He had the right to be upset with Indiana not giving him that team, because Indiana, and from what I've seen from their fans regarding this situation on Twitter and Instagram and other social media, is that they're just content to be a playoff team every year. In the end, they did get a good deal in the trade, though it maybe didn't seem like that at the time, but getting Sabonis and Oladipo, two guys who are all-star caliber players. I mean, Sabonis was an all-star this year, but those guys are never going to push them into a championship level. It's just not going to happen, and Pacers fans are content being a playoff team every year, and that's it. Not really challenging, but just being there in the playoffs. And the front office seems to be content with that as well. At some point in the history of a franchise, they need to make that risk. If they're not a huge market team, they need to go and make that risk to be that championship level team, even for a couple years. It's simply not good enough to just be a playoff team every year, just being modest, underwhelming, never really making that huge push to an NBA championship. The Raptors were like that for a while, but Masai Ujiri made the gutty, the ballsy, the very risky move in trading star player and franchise man DeMar DeRozan to obtain Kawhi Leonard from the San Antonio Spurs. And because of only that 1 year, we knew it was a big risk getting Kawhi Leonard on that 1 year, but why not? Go out and try to win a championship, because this system isn't good enough. It's not going to get us over the line. So acquiring Kawhi Leonard and going for that championship, and it got him the chip. It's the difference maker, that big risk, because without that trade, the Raptors would have never won an NBA championship. At some point, Indiana needs to decide to make this risk. Are they happy just being a playoff team every year, or do they really want to go challenge for an NBA championship? Because since they merged to the NBA through the ABA merger, they have never even played in an NBA Finals. So I think the front office is to blame for this situation. They should have done a little bit more to put Paul George with some better players to make those deep playoff runs. Even if they are a cheap organization, they needed to risk it and try to get some firepower to really go for it with Paul George, because they had a special player. Paul George fell in the draft to them, and he was a special talent that they could not utilize to his max potential because of the inability to find teammates to play with him. They're a bit like the Utah Jazz of the East. You know, the Jazz, they're making all these great moves, but again, it's never going to be good enough to push them over the line for an NBA championship. At some point, you need to be dissatisfied with being a 4, 5, 6 seed every season and really push and really try to get that championship. Even if you waste a decade of just being mediocre playoffs for 2 years of really going for it, at least you will know that at the end of the day, even though if you didn't win a championship, you knew you did everything you could for that team to win the championship. And if it didn't happen, it didn't happen. But at least you tried, and you know that since you did it, it didn't quite happen. But in other situations, like with the Raptors, who went for it all for 1 year, they got that championship. And that championship is well worth it. That championship is well worth being mediocre for a decade later. That championship means everything. There are a lot of franchises who just go humongous stretches without a championship or don't have one in their history. And the Indiana Pacers are one of them. And it's time to make a risk every now and then. And I think 2017 was the time to do it. Oh, yeah! That's my spiel. I mean, obviously both parties are to blame a little bit, but I'm mostly leaning towards Indiana on this one. But that's the end of this video. Please like the video if you like, and subscribe to Amateur Sports for more content just like this as well. Hit that notification bell. We post 4 times a week. So much insight and opinion on the sporting world, mostly NBA, but a lot of soccer as well. But that's it for this one. At the end of the day, I believe what I say, and if you disagree, that's okay. We'll see you again next time.